In the sweltering summer of 1565, a tiny sun-baked rock in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea became the stage for one of the most brutal and decisive battles in human history. This was the Great Siege of Malta. On one side stood the mightiest military power of the age, the Ottoman Empire, led by the aging but formidable Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. On the other side stood a desperate handful of Christian knights, the Knights Hospitaller, led by a master of war in his own twilight years, Jean Parisot de Valette. They were outnumbered at least 5-1, yet they refused to surrender. The French philosopher Voltaire would later remark that nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta. But why? This was more than just a battle. It was a clash of civilizations, a contest for the soul of the Mediterranean. Had the Ottomans prevailed, their path into southern Europe would have been wide open. Sicily, Italy, and even Rome itself would have lain at the mercy of the Sultan. But the Knights of Malta, against all odds, stood firm. This is the story of how a few hundred warriors, armed with faith, courage, and an unbreakable will, shattered an empire's aura of invincibility. To understand the siege of 1565, we must first understand the warriors at its heart, the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of St. John, were not merely soldiers, they were a religious order, sworn by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their mission, born during the Crusades, was to defend Christendom and care for pilgrims in the Holy Land. For centuries they had ruled the island of Rhodes with an iron fist, a thorn in the side of Muslim expansion. But in 1522, a young and ambitious sultan named Suleiman had had enough. He gathered a massive army and laid siege to Rhodes. After 6 months of desperate fighting, the knights were forced to surrender. They were allowed to leave with their lives and their honor, but they were homeless exiles wandering the capitals of Europe. For 7 years, they searched for a permanent home. Finally, in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V made them an offer they could hardly refuse. He granted them the island of Malta, a small, barren and rocky outpost in the central Mediterranean. In return, they were to pay an annual fee of 1 falcon. It seemed a poor gift, a desolate rock compared to their former home. But to the Grand Master of the time, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, it was a foothold. As he sailed into the Grand Harbour, he reportedly looked at the barren landscape and declared, "Nothing but a rock, but it will become a bastion of the faith." And so they built. They fortified the peninsula of Burgoo and its anchor, the formidable Fort St. Angelo. Later, fearing another attack, they built 2 new forts in record time, Fort St. Michael on the Senglia Peninsula and Fort St. Elmo, overlooking the harbour entrance. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean was becoming an increasingly dangerous place. The Ottoman Empire was at its zenith. Suleiman, now known as the Magnificent, had pushed his armies to the gates of Vienna. His navies, led by legendary admirals like Kheyr-ed-Din Barbarossa and his successor, the ruthless Dragut, ruled the waves. In 1551, the Ottomans tried to take Malta, but were repulsed. Instead, they ravaged the nearby island of Gozo, enslaving nearly its entire population of 5,000 people. They then seized Tripoli from the Knights. The noose was tightening. Then came the disaster of 1560. A massive Christian fleet, jointly sponsored by Spain and the Knights, was ambushed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Djerba. Half the Christian ships were sunk or captured. It was the worst naval defeat in a generation. The Ottoman admiral Piale Pasha had proven his mastery. The Mediterranean had become a Turkish lake. All eyes now turned to Malta. The Knights, under their newly elected Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, knew the storm was coming. By 1565, the conflict had become deeply personal. On one side was Suleiman the Magnificent, now 70 years old. He had conquered Belgrade, destroyed the Hungarian kingdom, and humbled the Persians. Only one Christian form remained embedded in his side: the Knights of Malta. His pride had been wounded by their constant raids on his shipping. The final straw came in 1564, when the Order's most famous sea captain, a renegade known as Romagus, captured a massive Ottoman treasure ship. Among the prisoners were the governor of Cairo and the former nurse of the Sultan's own daughter. This was an insult the Sultan could not ignore. He vowed to personally oversee the destruction of the Order and raze their fortress to the ground. Opposing him stood Parisot de Valette. At 70 years old, he was a mirror image of the Sultan in terms of experience and determination. He was a French nobleman who had joined the Order as a young man and had fought in almost every major engagement against the Ottomans for 50 years. He had spent a year as a galley slave after being captured by Barbarossa, an experience that filled him with a cold, burning hatred for the enemy. He was, by all accounts, a man of iron will. A contemporary described him as tall, lean, of a swarthy complexion, with a long white beard, dignified and grave, in manner calm and composed, a man who had suffered much in his youth and never forgotten. He was not just a leader, he was a father to his men and a rock of defiance in the face of annihilation. De Valette knew the attack was coming. His spies in Constantinople kept him informed of every ship built and every soldier levied. He begged the Christian princes of Europe for help, but Europe was divided. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the continent. The only promise of aid came from Philip II of Spain, who ordered his viceroy in Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, to prepare a relief force. But Don Garcia was cautious. He would only commit his troops if he was sure they could make a difference. The knights, it seemed, would have to bleed alone. On the morning of May 18, 1565, the watchman on the ramparts of Fort St. Elmo saw the horizon turn black. It was not a storm, it was an armada. The largest fleet assembled since the days of ancient Rome glided towards the harbor. There were nearly 200 ships, 131 galleys, 30 galleots, and numerous transports carrying an invasion force that modern historians estimate at between 30,000 and 40,000 men. These were the finest soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. Among them were 6,000 elite janissaries, the Sultan's household troops, slave soldiers raised from childhood to be the perfect warriors. There were thousands of Sipahi cavalrymen, feudal lords from Anatolia and Rumelia, and leading them were three of the most feared men in the Mediterranean: the naval commander Piyale Pasha, the overall army commander Mustafa Pasha, and the legendary corsair admiral Dragut, whom Suleiman himself called the drawn sword of Islam. As the fleet sailed into the harbor at Marsac's Lock, the knights and the Maltese population fell to their knees in the churches, praying for deliverance. De Valette, calm and resolute, gave his orders. He had a tiny force, roughly 500 knights, perhaps 1,000 foreign soldiers, and around 3,000 Maltese militia. In total, maybe 6,000 men capable of bearing arms. It was a David and Goliath struggle. De Valette made a crucial strategic decision. He knew he could not defend the entire island. He pulled his forces back into the fortified harbor cities of Birgu and Senglia, and the ancient capital of Medina in the interior. He also made a gamble regarding the small star-shaped fort at the tip of Mount Sibera's, Fort St. Elmo. This fort was isolated from the main defenses. Most military experts would have abandoned it, But de Valette understood that its position commanding the harbor entrance was too vital to cede without a fight. He needed time. Time for Don Garcia to gather his relief force in Sicily, and he was willing to sacrifice Fort St. Elmo and every man in it to buy that time. The Ottoman commanders disagreed on strategy. Mustafa Pasha wanted to attack the weaker inland capital of Medina first, but Admiral Piale, his rival, insisted on eliminating Fort St. Elmo to secure his fleet's anchorage. Dragut, arriving later, agreed with Piale. The assault on St. Elmo would be the first act of the tragedy. The Ottomans expected the fort to fall in 3 or 4 days. It was small, and its garrison numbered only a few hundred men, mostly Spanish and Italian soldiers, alongside a small contingent of knights. But the defenders had something the Ottomans did not count on: desperation. On May the 24th, the Ottoman guns opened fire. They had massive bronze cannons firing stone shots weighing up to 200 pounds. Day and night, the bombardment continued without pause. The fort was pounded into rubble. The defenders, sleeping amongst the bodies of their fallen comrades, held on. They repelled assault after assault, hurling Greek fire and boiling oil down onto the attackers. The battle became a war of nerves. From the walls of Fort St. Angelo, de Valette could see the flashes of the guns and the smoke rising from the distant fort. He sent reinforcements by boat under the cover of darkness, small groups of knights volunteering to enter the hell of St. Elmo. After 2 weeks of slaughter, Dragut, the master of siege warfare, grew impatient. He personally directed the placement of a new battery on the high ground across the peninsula, a position that enfiladed the fort. As he was overseeing the gun emplacement, on June 18th, a lucky shot from St. Elmo or St. Angelo screamed across the harbor. A splinter of rock struck the ground near Dragut. He fell. The most feared naval commander in the world was mortally wounded. His death sealed the fate of the fort, but inspired his men to a frenzy. On June 23rd, the Janissaries launched their final all-out assault. The defenders, reduced to a handful of wounded men, fought to the last. The commander, a Spanish knight named Don Melchior de Robles, was killed. The fort fell. Every single defender was dead, their bodies mutilated and their corpses nailed to wooden crosses and floated across the harbor to taunt the main garrison. The Ottomans had finally taken St. Elmo, but it had cost them 29 days and at least 6,000 of their best men, including their greatest admiral, Dragut. When Mustafa Pasha stood amidst the ruins, staring across the water at the main Christian forts, he reportedly shivered. "If so small a fort cost us such a price," he is said to have muttered, "what price shall we pay for the rest?" The sacrifice of St. Elmo had bought de Valette the precious time he needed. But the worst was yet to come. With St. Elmo gone, the Ottomans dragged their massive cannons across Mount Skiberras and began pounding the 2 main forts of Bergiu and Senglia. The bombardment was relentless, the worst the world had yet seen. For weeks, the sky rained stone and iron. The knights and the Maltese civilians lived in a hell of dust, smoke, and blood. But de Valette was a master of defense. He had prepared for this. He had stockpiled food and ammunition. He had repaired breaches under the cover of darkness. And he had a secret weapon: the people of Malta. Men, women, and children worked alongside the knights, filling gaps in the walls, tending the wounded, and hurling insults and stones at the enemy. The Ottomans tried everything. They built a massive siege tower, soaked in leather and vinegar to protect against fire, and rolled it towards the walls of Senglia. But Maltese engineers had secretly sapped the ground beneath it and de Valette's gunners, using a technique of concealing their cannon behind false walls, waited until the tower was in range. In a single devastating salvo, they destroyed it. On July the 15th, the Ottomans launched a massive amphibious assault on Senglia. 1,000 janissaries rowed across the harbour, while another force attacked by land. It was a moment of extreme peril. Senglia's governor, Captain Vincenzo Anastaghi, ordered his men to hold fast. Then, in a brilliant tactical move, de Valette spotted an opportunity. He ordered the only reserve he had, a handful of knights, to row a small boat across the harbour and attack the Ottoman flotilla from the rear. At the same time, the defenders of Senglia unleashed a deadly hail of arquebus fire. The janissaries, caught in a murderous crossfire and with their boats sinking, were slaughtered. The waters of the harbour literally turned red with blood. The fighting did not let up. In August, the situation became critical. The walls of Birgu were crumbling under the incessant bombardment. On August 7th, the Ottomans launched their largest assault yet, throwing thousands of men against the breaches at both Birgu and Senglia. For hours, the fighting was hand-to-hand, a savage melee of sword, axe, and dagger. De Valette himself, a man of 71, grabbed a pike and rushed to the breach, rallying his men with the cry, "He who dies today dies for the faith." At that moment, just as the Ottomans seemed on the verge of breaking through, a cry of alarm went up from the Ottoman camp. A small cavalry force of 100 knights, sallying from the ancient capital of Medina, had attacked the undefended Ottoman rear, killing the wounded and burning supplies. Mustafa, fearing the long-awaited relief army from Sicily had arrived, ordered a general retreat. The knights had been saved by a desperate bluff. Throughout the siege, the Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia, had been slowly assembling an army. He was afraid of losing his force in a reckless venture, but finally the pressure from his king and the heroic resistance of the knights forced his hand. On September 6th, a small force of 600 Spanish and Italian professional soldiers, later followed by the main relief army of around 8,000 men, landed on the northern coast of Malta. Far from the Ottoman camps, they marched towards the besieged forts, their banners flying. Mustafa Pasha realized the game was up. His army had been decimated by battle and disease. Of the original 30,000, perhaps only 15,000 were still fit to fight. He ordered a withdrawal. The retreat turned into a rout. As the Ottomans tried to re-embark on their ships, the knights and the Maltese burst from their battered forts and fell upon them with a fury born of 4 months of hell. They took a terrible revenge for St. Elmo. On September 11th, 1565, the last Ottoman ship sailed away from Malta. The Great Siege was over. The victory was absolute, but the cost was staggering. The city of Birgu was a pile of rubble. Over 2,500 knights and soldiers lay dead, along with perhaps 7,000 Maltese civilians, a third of the island's population. The Ottomans had lost over 25,000 men, the flower of their army. De Valette, the hero of the hour, was hailed throughout Europe. He rejected the Ottoman terms of surrender when they were offered, and immediately began work on a new, impregnable city on the heights of Mount Siberis, the very ground where Fort St. Elmo had stood. He named it Valletta, the city that still bears his name today. The Great Siege of Malta was a turning point. It marked the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into the Western Mediterranean. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. For the first time, Christian Europe had proven that the Turk could not only be resisted, but could be decisively defeated. The Knights of Malta had fulfilled their oath, standing as a wall of bone and steel against the tide of empire. They had turned a rock into a legend.